We promise to have many interesting discussions focused on the Latino community over the next year. Our goal is to make sure that people have an understanding of who Latinos among us are, how MLU, Maryland Latinos Unidos, can work together with you as nonprofits and government agencies to liaise with the community, to build out resources and information that are easy to access and connect communities to services of all kinds, but with a focus on health and education. This is a work in progress that is taking a bit of time to develop, but we hope it will really become an important resource for all of us to draw from. We're looking at it county by county, and it's about building the information. So as you know, we are in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month. And Hispanic Heritage Month begins on September 15th until October 15th. A fun fact, it is a month-long celebration to reflect the many nations that form part of the Latinx community, and it was established to celebrate the many contributions and influence of Hispanic Americans to the history, culture, and achievements of the United States. But it's also a recognition, and this is why it's a month long, that many of our Latin American countries celebrate their independence from Spain throughout the month. I see you, Guatemala, Mexico, Chile, just to name a few. We are going to begin this month-long celebration by embracing the concept of Latinidad. What is Latinidad anyway? So I'm going to be a little nerdy here. According to scholars, Latinidad is a Spanish language term that refers to the various attributes shared by Latin Americans and their descendants without reducing those similarities to any one single trait. I think it's really important to highlight who came up with this concept. It is a sociologist from Chicago. His name is Felix Padilla. He did a study in 1985 about Chicago's very unique and quite large Chicano, Mexicano, Puerto Rican community. And since then, this idea, this concept of Latinidad has been used by a wide range of scholars as a way to speak of Latino communities and cultural practices outside a strictly Latin American concept. In sum, from my perspective, it's the cultures, language, idioms, and common values we all share as a continent, from the continent's northernmost point, and you can pick that one, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego at its southernmost tip. Latinos are everywhere in the continent. And, you know, Spain left a very strong imprint on this land, which we will see today, whether we are born in one of its former colonies or whether the border crossed us, as Hispanics on the southwest border are fond of saying. It's not a radical concept. Latinos have been part of the United States since before it was formalized as an independent nation from Britain. The first city that was established, little walk down history lane, was St. Augustine, Florida, where the Spaniards built a fortress. And those of you who've traveled throughout Latin America will note that that fortress in St. Augustine is very similar to the fortress that is in San Juan, Puerto Rico, El Morro, and in Colombia, in Cali. Ponce de Leon was eager to find gold, but also the mythical fountain of youth. So there are many streets, but particularly in Miami, named after him, but they don't say Ponce de Leon, they say Ponce. Have you gone down Ponce? We were part of their empire until they lost control. And I apologize to any Spaniards who might be present or who are watching this. I hope this doesn't feel painful in any way. I've said this in the past and have received some rather intense reactions. But going back to Latinidad. So Latinidad is a concept that embraces colonialism as part of its construct. And in many ways, colonialism for Latinos is multiplied. In the United States, the rivalry between Spain and Britain played out. These two empires extracted our gold and other wealth. They also embraced something though, our food. They embraced our fruits. Think tomato, which the Italians used to call the love apple. This is a word that stems from the Nahuatl. Nahuatl, it's called Xitomatl. Nahuatl was the unifying language, the lingua franca of the indigenous nations throughout Mexico and Central America. Now, the empires embraced a few other things like our chocolate, to the extent that the Dutch actually built a stock market around it, and coffee. And of course, today's fruit du jour, which is the avocado. Much of the world's culinary origins stem from Latin America, and I would be remiss if I did not mention the humble potato. Imagine when Sir Francis Drake, this is a story I heard as a child, I don't know if it's actually true, but it's lovely, comes to meet Queen Elizabeth after his many exploits and bows before her, brings this gigantic trunk, opens it, and she's really excited and she's waiting to see what's inside, and it's potatoes. Little did she know, though, that these potatoes would be gold for her because they would help feed her people. And what would the Brits be without fish and chips? So what this all means is that we Latinos, Latinas, Hispanics, Latinx, Latine, Chicanos, Boricuas, Ticos, and all the other names that we call ourselves are embedded in the production of US society. We are producers of its culture, its food, and we are a very important part of its labor force. We are part of the economic and social engine that drives this country. Yet, many of us feel invisible. Our history feels at best misunderstood and at worst simply erased. But we're also very optimistic. And this is what I love about us, because we always give it ganas. And for those of you who don't know that term, ganas is really, we give it all we got. We put it all on the table and we sweat it out and we get it done. We do our best to overcome whatever barriers we are facing by embracing our values, which are most often centered in family and community broadly defined. But you're not here to listen to me pontificate. You're here to listen to these two young women that are about to introduce themselves, Laura Gutiérrez, whom many of you know, and Shaeleigh Severino, whom you are about to meet. Laura is the Community Service Director for the City of Annapolis. She recently received a promotion and works closely with Mayor Gavin Buckley. Shaeleigh Severino works for us at Maryland Latinos Unidos, and she has graciously agreed, because this is recent, to become our communications manager. But what I want to say to you about these two young women is the following. They are much more, they represent far more than their titles, than their resumes. And it is this story that I wanted to share with all of you. So I will invite them now to introduce themselves. Let's start, I'll ask the question and you two can start telling us a little bit more about yourselves. So share a little bit about your personal story as an introduction, where your family roots originate, and how you identify yourselves. You're both these young Latinas with very different backgrounds, coming from very, literally from two poles. Shay's family is from the Caribbean, from the Dominican Republic. DR is in the house. And Laura is from Argentina. How does beyond the flags, how does your Latinidad get interpreted in your lives, in how you work, in how you feel, and how you think? Let's start with you, Laura, and then go over to Shay.
Okay, so I'm Laura, and thank you so much, Gabby, for having us here today. And I'm excited to get to talk a little bit about my background and my family, my history, what I think about my culture, because it's not something that we do on the day-to-day. So I am from Argentina. I was born in Argentina. My dad is from Argentina. All of his side of the family is there still. And my mom is here from the US. I identify as Argentine American, as Latina. And yeah, so that's sort of a little bit in the most brief way where I'm from and my background. I was living in Argentina and here, sort of back and forth. I've always traveled back and forth since I was born. Essentially, every summer I'd spend in the US, and I was living in Argentina until I was about 9, and then went back after for a year after high school, and then after college I moved back to Argentina, and only recently did we come back to the US when I got married and had my kiddo. Yeah, it's I'd say and I've read this article in the New York Times. I'd shared this with you, Gabby, once, but about 4 or 5 years ago I read this article in the New York Times, and they were talking about how so many young adults are amphibians, and that's sort of one of the things that I think all the time of myself. I'm sort of this amphibian that can fit in here, that can fit in there, and because of my background, I can fit in so many different places and learn about other people and appreciate all those different nuances. So I think that's a part of, when we're talking about Latinidad, that's a part of what we bring to the table. It brings us culture, you know, a lot of color, community, family, asados for me. Great food, resilience, like you were just sharing, and that go get 'em attitude, that don't give up attitude, our history, our tradition, our history of revolutions in our countries. So those are sort of the things I think about when I think of Latinidad.
What about you, Shay?
Yeah, so thank you for having me and thank you for everyone here. My name is Shay, she, her pronouns, and I am Dominican. My parents came to the United States in the 80s, most like most people. And so they landed in New York, the typical place of Washington Heights. So I wasn't born and raised there, but there's 4 of us, I'm the youngest of 4. And so my parents, once they had the oldest, they were like, no, vamos a ir para un lugar that's a little bit more like more family oriented, a little bit more suburb. And we landed in Queens. And so I grew up in Queens, New York. But because I had family that had come from the DR as well, living in Washington Heights, I was literally like there every summer. And if you know anything about New York, Washington Heights is like a mini Dominican Republic transplant. And so the culture, the family values, everything in between is very much similar to as if you're in the island. And so having that environment was really, really amazing. And kind of just part of my entire childhood and identity, really. In terms of what do I identify as Afro-Latina, very, very clear at this point. And so I've always pretty much identified as Afro-Latina. My parents raised us in a household where we were very proud to be Afro-Latinos. Even though it's not a very big conversation, they were like, yeah, like we're Black and we're also Latinos, and that's perfectly okay. And no one can take away your heritage and who you are, your identity. And so having that be a standing point growing up, it was actually very difficult being a proud Afro-Latina, because a lot of folks didn't really understand what that meant. And I think that's still an ongoing conversation of what is Afro-Latinidad and how does that fit into the mold of Latinidad in general, into our cultures, into our history. Do we get that representation? Do we get that acknowledgement that we exist? And so that's always been a bigger conversation. I'm happy that we have a platform here right now to talk about it a little bit more and a little bit in depth about what does that look like for our communities and how do we ensure that representation is there through every corner and every crevice, through every field, and everything in between.
Wow. Like I said, they are much more than their titles and their resume. So a nerd question. So in my opening, I presented a basic definition of the concept of Latinidad. Perhaps you could share a little bit. I mean, you started that conversation, but maybe go a little more in depth about what Latinidad means to you, and how it impacts how you work actually, and how you approach problem solving when you're working in community. Does it open doors? I mean, Laurita, you mentioned, sorry, Laura, I'm diminutive, I shouldn't do that. You mentioned that you embrace your amphibianness, you embrace seeing different cultures and blending in and filling in gaps, etc. Maybe you could share a little bit more about that. What do you think?
Sure. So, I'd say there's I'm not sure how to respond to this in the best way, but I'd say I bring my culture and my beliefs and everything that is quintessentially me. It's just part of my identity of being Latina to my work. And I can't take that apart. Like it's not, there is nothing that I can stow away and say, I'm going to put that hat over there and just focus on doing community services and systems. And I'm not going to focus on my community. And it's something that is ingrained in everything I do, right? It's whether it's getting a phone call and the person is struggling and I'm like, okay, hablo español, like let's just change and let me make this a little bit easier for you because I can also help you on that. Or having a conversation and seeing that somebody's struggling trying to write information down and then saying, okay, here's a flyer with this information, but here's also let me send you a WhatsApp audio so you can have that in a voiced out system so that you also know what I'm saying or what it says here. It's about when I'm looking at how do I develop grant making and give out grants in our community, am I being equitable and inclusive? Am I, not only am I looking at the big picture, but also then saying, okay, let me stop and look at, okay, where are the neighborhoods? Have I reached every neighborhood? Have I reached every community? And so a lot of people sometimes don't think about that because you're not used to having to fight for getting different rights, for getting different access to services. And because that's part of also the struggle for the Latino community, that's one of the things that it's ingrained, that every time I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, is this being represented? Is this something that I need to push more on? Is there a way that we can build voices around to make sure that we're building power for our community, to make sure that these things happen? So I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent here, but that is sort of the way that I approach it in my work, in my life. It's a part of me, and I can't, I bring all of me to the table. I can't flip on one switch or turn off another. It's who I am.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. I think that's a very real thing for me too. I always bring it, like you can't split yourself. I used to be very melodramatic as a young person and say things like, I walk a border every day of my life, because I felt like I was divided into two countries and then some. I always considered myself pan-Latina because I had lived in so many different Latin American countries. But it's not about me, it's about you. So Shay, tell me about you. You chose communications on top of it, which I find fascinating because I feel like it's connected somehow. Talk a little bit about how you do this.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off by saying that I completely hear you, Laura, and it's very similar to me in the sense of I bring my whole self to everything that I do. My entire worldview is based on serving my community, and that's both the Black community and the Latino community. And so a little backstory, and I won't go too long, hopefully. My mother's an organizer. She's been an organizer her entire life, and I was raised in an organizing household. So for me, my first trait is to be an organizer, is to be in the streets fighting for our people, whether that's protests, rallies, whether it's providing resources, support, whatever it might look like. That's my first home forever. And being raised on those values, it was interesting. It was very, very interesting being raised on that and having to navigate that. It's not about us, but about all of us. It's about being for us, by us. It's about incorporating that collective power for us to be able to advance in whatever it is that we're trying to achieve. And so that has navigated how I move in every space that I'm in. And choosing communications was actually a very interesting pathway for me. Like I mentioned, I started in organizing, and then from there, I was like that rebel child that was like, you know, what's the footsteps of my mom, right? Like, I'm not gonna do what she did. And I'm gonna do my own thing. And for me, that was law, that was legal, that was immigration. Immigration has been a big part of my entire life for over 5 years as a paralegal. And so being able to do a lot more of immigration advocacy and immigration policy, legislation drafting, and all of everything in between, I realized that as much as I love the courtroom and as much as immigration does impact our communities the hardest, it's not the only path for me. And then from there, I pivoted towards politics because legislation is how we're going to change a lot of these issues. Legislation is how we're going to be able to really push our communities forward in a way that's going to be extremely impactful for the long term, right? And so from there, I realized, wait, a lot of people don't know how to speak to our communities. They don't know how to navigate this. And so that's how I actually really got into communications, because I saw this need and this huge gap of how do we communicate to us? How do you reach us? You know, Laura mentioned WhatsApp. Listen, these WhatsApp trains that we have, that's where we are at, okay? We are in WhatsApp day and day. So it's something that a lot of people don't realize, and it's a way to mobilize our communities, to get us active, to get us, you know, really in the know about what's going on around us and how it's affecting us, that they might not, you know, have the time or capacity to really understand because of their day-to-day. And so that's the role that I play of coming in and like, here's what you need to know, right? Here's what the resources that you might need for whatever issue that you might be having right now. And here's the next step for us to be able to get you what that is, right? And so there's communications is such a broad space, and it's so many different spaces that that the need exists, right? And so that's how I bring my day to day. But I also want to touch on the other point of my identity and how that intersects with this work. So I'm a very clear Afro-Latina, right? Like there's no dismissing it. But to some extent, my Latinidad has been erased in a way through, not just through communications, but through any space that I have been in. And I think that's a conversation that most people don't really recognize, because when they first see me, all they see is Black. They don't see the Latinidad aspect. They don't see that I'm also Dominican. And so there has been situations where I'm like, I just have to like pull out the Spanish, like Laura said, like, espérate, podemos hablar español. Like we can speak Spanish, hold on, like it's okay. And they're like, oh my God, like you're Latina? And I'm like, yeah. And it's like a whole thing, because it's like, it's not mainstream. Afro-Latinos were not mainstream. We're not what you first see when you turn on your TV, when you put on Telemundo, right? Like we're not the first thing that you see. And so having that conversation, it has been ever evolving. It's been talking about how does that look like in our countries. You know, Mexico recently added Afro-Latinos as a form to identify in 2015, right? Like that's so crazy. A third of the population of Cubans are Black Cubans, right? Like these are so much bigger conversations that we need to be having, not just here in the US, but, you know, internationally, about what does that look like, and how can we make sure that we're at the forefront of the work that we're trying to do in whatever field that we're in.
That's right. You just made me think about a number of meetings I first had when I arrived in Washington 20 years ago. And my first big international meeting was with a group of Afro-Colombianos. About 25 of them who'd come to the United States to better understand race relations and how what could they learn in the United States. And I asked them, I said, what can we learn from you? Because this is complicated, it's complex. It's not complicated, it's complicated, but it's also very complex. There's a lot of layers to this, which is also one of the reasons why I like this concept of Latinidad, because it embraces all of that, or it's supposed to. You know, that idea of not reducing it down, but actually opening it up and including all of the different experiences. So I do want to talk a little bit more about your, but you've been, you know, you're talking a lot about Afro-Latina, right? You're an Afro-Latina. And there are not so many in the US as we think, right? Because the media doesn't make you highly visible. I think, you know, I think there's a sort of a stereotype media presentation person in Univision and Telemundo, especially the anchors of the news. Maybe tell us a little bit more about how the community is needs to be seen, wants to be seen. You know, because it's I'm not even sure what to ask you, because I feel like, you know, we all wear many different hats, but like you said, yeah, it's very clear you're Afro-Latina. Sometimes I think we have our own internal biases as Latinos, not thinking about, oh, Afro-Latinos, of course, because in Mexico, as you said, 2015, the community isn't that large. It's very deep and it's very engaged, and it's very regionalized too. It's mostly from the South. But tell us a little bit about how you see us moving forward as Latinos.
Yeah, I think the first part is recognizing that inherent biases that might exist. You know, when we're in a room full of Latinos, and I've been in these situations, it's like, oh, you speak Spanish or Latina? It's like that question mark of, oh, are you like Latina enough? And again, like that was something that being in as diverse and growing up in a diversity as New York, like that was still a conversation where it's like, you know, we have like the Spanish cliques and the different cliques that exist in any school. And it's just like, oh, but you're Latina? Like, I don't know. Are you sure? And I'm just like, like, what do you mean? Am I sure? Of course. And so it's like that constant having to kind of prove that I'm Latina enough. And I think that inherent bias
of course,
is very common, a lot common than we like to recognize. And the identity of Afro-Latinidad, it does vary, but it's very widespread, right? Like Dominican Republic, for example, we're 90% Black. Like most of us are Black. But I think when we talk about racial identities and not just that, but racial politics, right? In DR, 90% of us are Black, but race relations don't work that way. For us, we're just Dominican. But if you ask any Dominican, oh, am I Black? It's like, I'm Dominican, because we're such a mixture of so many different identities, right? We're Taino, we're Black, we're also European. Like, we're so mixed that it's just like there's no way to just like reduce it to just as one thing, because we're everything. And so when we talk about race here in the United States, it's so different from the Caribbean. It's so different from any other Latino country. And here in the US, we're recognizing it more and more. There's actually 6 million people that identify as Afro-Latinos in the United States, and we're growing. And there's a huge conversation about what does it look like to be Afro-Latino as a voting bloc, right? Because as we become more aware of our identity and take claim of it and have finally a word for everything that we are, right? Which is Afro-Latinidad. You know, what does that mean in the voting, when it comes to voting? What does that mean when it comes to elections? What does that mean to representation? Richie Torres was the first Afro-Latino to be in Congress. And he's like, we don't have Afro-Latino caucus. I need something, right? And so like, that's a conversation that we're having, like even in the political spaces of what does it mean to have one, proper representation, right? And then two, how do we create space and move forward and by doing that, right? And that's gonna make a lot of people uncomfortable. It's gonna make both Latinos uncomfortable, both Black people uncomfortable. Everyone's gonna be very uncomfortable by these changes, because it's gonna be a bigger conversation, and it's gonna be something that kind of shifts people's ideas and people's worldviews, because this isn't a mainstream topic or conversation, right? And then we talk about Latinos. The last person that was in main media and was proud and even got the screen time was Celia Cruz, right? Like Celia Cruz is our icon, and I love her. I play her every morning, like she's my girl, right? But before her, there wasn't much conversation. After her, we have maybe Amara La Negra for like millennials, Gen Z, as myself, you know, like she's the other artist that has been very, very vocal about being Afro-Latina. And she even has talked about the issues that she has faced, trying to get even more attraction to the work that she's trying to do, being in mainstream media. And so the conversation is going to keep going. And I think as more of us Afro-Latinos, we stand up and be vocal and be loud and be proud and, you know, start these conversations, we're going to be able to continue to move forward. And I think it's going to also take the part of more Latinos to be willing to listen. I think willing to listen and also expand their ideas of what it means to be Latino.
So Laura, you come from the other end of Latin America, all the way down at the bottom. You're, you know, I'm going to say something very unseemly, but I think it was one of the first things when I moved to Chile. It was always really shocking to me that the weather was the exact opposite of what it was in the United States, that when it was winter here, it was summer there, and it would get, let's just say it was a little confusing. And you grew up probably thinking that the weather in the US was weird, right? Because you grew up down there. Talk about your Southern Cone experience, because the reality is there are not a lot of Argentinos here in the United States. I mean, there's pockets, particularly like in Florida and even New York, but even here in Maryland, it seems we have one of our steering committee members is Argentino, and yet it's a different culture in so many ways. It has a little bit more of a European tone to it. And yet there's also this strong indigenous component and a very rural, romantic perspective to it. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, one time I invited you to speak at a cafecito and you brought your mate. You didn't bring your cafe, you brought your mate. That's
I
very
have it here too.
there you are. And it's very
I'm never without. So it's funny, a lot of things that Shay's sharing are sort of things that I can relate to, in that, you know, now I'm even dyed blonde, but I have green eyes. I'm pretty white, light skin. And I've always been the one that can pass as a gringa, as chunky. And that's also a whole part of complicated Latino identity. And whether you know, like, what is this you can pass as? My mom's American, my dad's Argentine. I am American, like, and I am white and I am Latina, and I have these many different pieces of me. And that's something that it is also a part of my identity. And it has had moments where it can be awkward or weird. Or when I started college at Penn, it was like, do I go to the casa and present myself? Because when I walk in, people would look at me like, you're not a part of this, or you are. And in Argentina, my friends would always say, oh, but you're like the gringa, because you are living in the States now, so you're not really like us. And then and then here it'd be like, you're not really like us. So there's a part where, like I was talking about, you're an amphibian, you fit in and you blend in, but at the same time you also don't, right? Like there's always something that's a little bit different. And that's one of the pieces that I also always struggle with, and try to own and just be real about it and share it. And it is what it is, right? You were sharing about my dad in Argentina is heavily involved in organizing.
He's an organizer.
He's a union leader at the national, international levels. My mom is a professor at GW. So very different styles, but my mom was also an organizer in Argentina. They met when he was a political prisoner, or when he just got out of being in jail at a protest. So also the organizing piece is deeply ingrained in my identity. And that's also when we talk about Latinidad, I think of the struggles and the resilience and the revolutions as part of it, because it's also such a big part of my family history. Even my mom was one of the people that was working to try to get my dad out of jail, because she was working with cells and working to get other political prisoners out. And that whole group of friends of my dad's are all people who had really lived that struggle and were political prisoners together, and because of that are so tight today, right? And that's also a huge piece that isn't discussed and people don't understand here. Like, oh, what do you mean your dad was in jail? Like that is so taboo. And then to explain that there's a whole political component to that, and then that it's about Latin American politics, which is, are you, what exactly are you in that political sphere? Which is another piece that we bring from Latin America, is the very different political identities. And even in Argentina, there's like 200 political groups. I was heavily involved in politics in Argentina, and I love that, and I'm still involved here. And that's also a piece that when we're trying to bring a new identity in the States and try to pull in your history from before, it's hard to navigate and figure out how those different pieces lie together. And that's sort of, I don't know, when you're trying to figure out the sort of geopolitical context, what does it mean to be one or the other? And Republican, Democrat, Popular, or what, all these different spaces, how do they fit together here? And everybody has these cookie cutter ideas, but that's not quite right. So I don't know if that's the best answer here, but I say there's just a lot of this ambiguity that we navigate, and that the biggest piece is just saying we own that and we're proud of that, and bringing it to light and not shying away from it.
I agree very much so. I feel for me, everything both of you have said really resonates. And actually, actually you're making me think of another question. So really it's kind of what we're talking about is the history of the relationship between Latin America and the United States. I mean, that's kind of what it boils down to in so many ways. And it's a very long and complex history. And I believe deeply that there are many interdependencies, and doesn't matter. I mean, it's something, as I was writing this, I realized it doesn't matter like where you're from. Somehow the United States is a part of your life, even if because you have a relationship. We all have a relationship with the United States as the largest economic power in the region, right? But there's more. I mean, there's been a longer relationship, a deeper relationship. The United States built the Panama Canal, for example. And we forget about these relationships historically, I think. So these interdependencies, economic and social, how do you see that? Because obviously, you know, both of you are products of migrations, right? You know, and this is the work we're doing. I mean, Shay, you actually work with immigrants as a paralegal, and Laura, you were the chair of an immigration group in Anne Arundel. Maybe explain a little bit, how do you interpret it, and what do they mean to Maryland? Like, how do you think this means, what do you think this means to Maryland and to the United States overall? Big picture question, but with the idea that it gets granular.
I mean, there's this idea of the US saving Latin America, right? And helping, and that here from the US, we know best for what is needed in Latin America, and we can go and fix it, and it's where we've got the right answers to everything, and that that's a struggle, right? Because especially when you're from both ends of it, and then from Latin America wanting to be independent, but at the same time also needing certain supports and those supports end up being conditioned into the ways that can serve other countries. So there's this weird love-hate relationship between the countries that even, you know, like I was sharing, I have grown up in both countries with Argentina and the US, and, you know, my friends in Argentina would be like, oh, like, how amazing to live in the US, and oh, how do you do that? You know, like, why would you ever go there? So it's a total love-hate relationship, and that sort of translates into the it's sort of inherited, I would say, from that complicated political context. It's very interlaced, and you can't really, I mean, I keep going back to that, how it's so interlaced, but you just can't have that Latinidad without looking at the geopolitical context. You can't think about, you know, what does it mean to be Latino in the States without considering the country they're from. Even when we were doing throughout the pandemic, the education on vaccines, we'd get questions about, oh, but what about the Sinopharm? And I'm like, what's the Sinopharm? Oh, wait, my dad was talking about the Sinopharm. They have that in Argentina. They don't have that in the US. Let me go back. And so then you have to go back to learning about what's going on in that country of origin. And that's a part of what we're doing here. So it's always intertwined in a way that is very complex to try to understand that US Latin America relationship.
What do you think, Shay?
Yeah, I 100% agree everything that Laura said. It's actually ironic because every time that I speak to family members of the year, they're like, la vida allá en Estados Unidos, like they think everyone is rich in the US. And it's just
Yes,
like,
they
no, it's not like that. But yeah, I think in terms of the geopolitical scene, it's very complicated. I think in addressing the elephant in the room, you know, the US has colonized most of Latin America and the Caribbean. And so we have to address that.
Puerto Rico.
Right, Puerto Rico still. And so it's just like when we look at the landscape, our entire countries have been erupted by colonization, by imperialism. And so I think when we start at the root, we can address kind of like the longstanding issues that we still have now, where it's like a lot of these countries can't continue without US relations, right? Like they can't continue to, they can't do nothing without trade, especially when it comes to the US, right? And so I think when we talk about the relations between the US and Latin America, they're going to continue to be deeply tied and deeply rooted because of that. In terms of how does that affect us now, I think, especially dealing with a lot of immigrants and the immigrant community, when we think about, you know, our longstanding just family values, I would say, I think I'm going to bring it down to that, family values. Organically, we're going to always find each other. Organically, we're always going to have that connectivity to ensure that we're looking out for one another. And I think that's a beautiful piece that has come out of that we've been able to take something as such as colonization, imperialism, and kind of convert it to something that's powerful for us and our communities. And so I think that's a way that we can mobilize our communities here in the US now, where it's like, we're one, right? Like whether we're here in the US or whether we're out back in our home country, we're still very much united through a lot of the issues, a lot of the difficulties that we might be facing. And unfortunately, I think a lot of immigrants come to the US with this idea of like the white picket fence, the American dream. And I think that when it goes down to it, that's not always 100% the case. And so when it comes to finding community and finding, where are we going to relocate? Like I mentioned before, Washington Heights is like the home of Dominicans. Every country, every community has that across the globe, like across the US. We have
There's a little Mexico everywhere.
Yeah, like little Mexico, little Colombia, like all of these different places exist. And I think that has been the beautiful product of the longstanding history that we've had geopolitically. And I think moving forward, when we think about how do we mobilize the Latino community, and that has been a continuous conversation, especially when it comes electorally, when it comes to mobilizing folks for everything in between. It has been, how do you do it? Like, we don't know how to mobilize a Latino community. We don't know how to talk to them.
That's okay. So that's something I'd love to dive into a little bit with both of you.
Yeah.
How do we use our Latinidad then to organize ourselves, to really build connectivity and collective strength? I mean, Veronica, you and I, we've talked about this a lot. It's actually why MLU was formed. I would love to hear from you both what your perspectives are, because you both come from a long line of organizers. And so that's in your DNA, your respective DNA. But also you've got really, you're in unique places to be able to support that. So I would love to hear some of your ideas, and then also open it up to the audience. What do you think? Go ahead. Whoever wants to give it a go.
Yeah, I can continue from there. I think, me and Laura talked about coming from a long history of organizers. I think as Latinos, we're organically and naturally, inherently, all of the above.
All of us are organizers.
We're all organizers, right? At some point, someone in our families and organizers, somehow we've been ingrained into those family values, and it's part of our culture. It's part of who we are. We're naturally always going to be like, what can I do to help? Oh, que tú necesitas. Like, it's always going to be a natural thing for us because of where we come from. And so I think in terms of how do we mobilize our communities moving forward, I think it's all about outreach. I think it's about, and it's ironic for me to say that because I'm in communications, but I really do believe that that's going to be like the method of organizing our communities. It's through communications, it's through outreach, it's through finding those unique different pots of ways to reach people in a way that we will respond to, right? And so we can organize folks and be like, we're having a community barbecue. That's a method to organize, right? Like, we're going to have a fiesta, like, let's organize there, right? Let's make sure that everyone's registered to vote, or they're able to partake in the voting process, even if they don't have citizenship. And I think that's also a part of the conversation. Like, you don't have to have papers to be involved, to be engaged. And I think when we talk about how do we mobilize our communities, it's about all of us. It's not just those that can vote. It's about all of us that can play a role to achieving the goals that we have for our communities. And so I think that for us, we are uniquely positioned to do that work. We're uniquely positioned to be able to do that outreach to people that are looking for another home, right? Like I said, we have these pockets of our communities. We can do that outreach and be like, look, like, let's do this. Like, let's unite and form this plan, or whatever the case may be. We're going to be able to have those conversations directly with people. What are those issues that you're dealing with? What are the resources that you need? How can we get that to you? And so by having those methods of communications, those methods of outreach, those methods of letting people know that they have a place that they can go to if they need anything, that's where we come in. That's how we're going to be able to kind of push this forward and ensure that our community is not only informed, because that's a huge thing that we haven't really addressed or talked about, is the fact that a lot of people don't have the information that they need, right? So being able to provide that information and knowledge, but also providing that space of comfortability, because I think that that's also very dismissed. And in terms of the question of like how a lot of politicals always ask, how do I mobilize a Latino community? Listen, let me tell you one thing about us: we will unite. We will get together. We will gossip. We will talk whatever we have to talk about. We will be there, but we will be there for one another. So the real way to kind of get to Latino communities is doing it for each other. And so by being the few folks that are in these spaces, the few folks that are in politics, and I'm hoping that in my lifetime, that number expands, you know, as Gen Z, I'm hoping that I see more and more of us. And obviously through the pathway that all of you have led for us, you know, we were able to open that door and say, like, we're going to look out for one another and want to be here, you know, for those values and for those legislation pieces that we really need to get past. And it's only going to happen through each other and for each other.
Laura, jump in.
That's so true right there. It's, you know, a big part of the work we do. And when folks ask about how to organize and how to reach out, it's a lot through relational organizing, or from the people who are, you know, a part of the ingrained community, and you work with those people to get, you know, if I didn't have people who open doors for me, I wouldn't be able to do the work I do. And a lot of us wouldn't be able to do the work we do if we didn't have those key people who opened the doors for us to connect with our neighbors. And it has to be like, if you don't know your neighbor, then how are you going to convince them to organize? How are you going to convince them to come out for you, or come out for your community, come out for the greater cause, the greater good? You know, and there's a part of it that's about, you know, being physically present, about having human contact that is really important in our community, I think. There's a part of us that it's about embracing your individual identity, and at the same time making you feel like you're a part of the larger Latino community, embracing your country of origin. I think that's huge. There's a lot of national pride of, you know, your flag, and finding a way to pull that in is also really important. But you know, there is a framework that ties us all together. We talked about it at the beginning of what is Latinidad, and we were talking all about the culture, the passion, the colors, the foods, you know, and that brings us into fiestas. So, you know, exactly what Shay was saying, but is a general framework. We have to use that framework. We have to embrace everyone, make you feel like you're a part of it, because they are, and then embrace that individual story, history, learn about them, what's going on, where do they come from, what is their family history. I mean, from the little time that we just had together, I think you guys now know a little bit about my family history that generally isn't shared, and you would not think of when you look at me. So that's the same thing for everybody else around us. One of the folks that I work with closely was a Olympic runner for in Salvador, and she was in the London Olympics, you know, and nobody would know that unless you get the time, spend the time, you know, have a meal together, have a drink together, go to a community barbecue together, and learn about each other. And that's how we start to build up. It's very different, I would say, what's going on in Maryland versus what's going on across the country. You know, we are not as far advanced as, for example, California or even New York has, you know, it has an incredible advances in terms of cultural acceptance and organizing. And Maryland's a little bit further behind, and it's a newer community, and a lot of folks that are recent immigrants, and first-gen immigrants. So there's not as many young Latinos, or they're just starting, like they're in their 15, 16-year-olds, and those are the people that are Latino Americans. So, you know, it's just learning those nuances is really important for the work we do, and for organizing, and for understanding where we are and what we need to do to continue coming together and advancing and bettering the community for our Hispanic Latino community.
Right. For all the different ways we name ourselves. I'm going to bring in Veronica, but I also want to comment on there's a really wonderful comment in the chat about how a lot of our folks arrive having some distrust in their government because their governments have been abusive, and it seems to be generating some buzz here. Let's see. And then someone commented back, I think it's an interesting thought from Anna about the community having distrust, especially adults and older folks, and younger folks are raised in the States. A lot of young people are less interested in politics, although it's been changing over the last 10 years, but it makes the perfect storm. A portion of the older Latino community doesn't have as much trust in the government, and I don't see the bottom part. Oops, here we go. And the young people who are here have some distrust or lack of interest. So Veronica, let me hand it over to you.
Oh my goodness, the pressure to follow this brilliance, señores. You know, first of all, I absolutely love Hispanic Heritage Month, and I hate it, right? I hate it because we're being condensed to 30 days when in reality we are here year round. And I love the discussions because I love the highlights. Let's pause for a second and have our birthday, right? This is our birthday moment for 30 days. So that's why I hate it and I love it
Well, wait a
simultaneously.
second. Actually, Veronica, we're 2 years old.
No. I mean,
No,
MLU's
I know,
birthday,
but I mean,
absolutely. So
Maryland
that's our
Latinos
anniversary.
Unidos is also 2 years old last week. Anyway,
Time
but keep
flies.
going.
Time flies. But for the Latino community in the US, you know, Hispanic Heritage Month serves as our birthday celebration, right? For 30 days, people pause and give us attention and gift us a lot of love and attention. And then fast forward, you know, December, January, we no longer exist. So there's that love-hate
Right.
relationship. But I
Fair.
absolutely love the concentrated focus on just our uniqueness and our competitive advantages. I love seeing the diversity that our youth is bringing between Laura and Shay. Last night I participated in the Legislative Latino Caucus with a couple of you. And there were dancers ranging from 10 years old and up dancing US modern dance to folkloric Mexican dances. And then just to sit there, I felt like I was having a moment like you're on stage and the light's shining on you, a moment of this is us. We have these
Mm.
beautiful light skin, dark skin, all diverse kind of looking people that don't fit in any bucket with perceptibly outside demeanors of, oh, they fit, they're Americans, they're white, oh, they're black, or they're this. And we're so much more. We have so many other dimensions. So I had that moment of, we are so much more. And I like the fact that we're finally celebrating that. We're finally peeling the onions. The terminology, the phrases, the definitions are finally surfacing so we can come up to terms. And we can comfortably say, no, soy Afro-Latina. You know, I got to say I'm Dominican and standing next to Shay. You know how many people look at me confused? What do you mean you're Dominican? And then I have to do the Shay move where I have to drop a couple Dominican curses, right? Where I really need to just walk around with a plátano everywhere I go. So people go, oh, there's a Dominican there. So it's our reality. But I love the fact that that's become, I don't want to say weapon because that sounds aggressive. I think it's become our superpower. Our superpower, our superpower. I think Laura said it really beautifully. It's who we are. So there's no, how do you bring yourself to work? What do you mean? I am me. I'm not bringing anything. It's just who I am. I know that's disconcerting to a lot of folks. I think they don't know how to handle us. I get a lot of feedback that I'm intimidating. People don't know what to do with me. Ay, que tú eres mucho, tú asustas a la gente. Okay, I'm okay with that. It's not my issue. That's their issue. So I just wanted I asked Gabriela to give me just 2 minutes to celebrate us as a community, to just pause and really look at these incredibly talented younger women. And then just, I mean, the articulation, the depth of knowledge, the education, that's not an anomaly. This is really the talent that we have as a culture. So I'm listening to them rattling off all this content and it's flowing up their tongue like they're hanging out. So I'm sitting there going, oh my God, we're in great hands. So, mi gente, I'm just going to ask you to, for a moment, we are fighting constantly all these atrocities we're seeing. Our people are getting shipped from place to place. We're being used as political pawns. Women's rights are being regressed. Everything is yucky except for there are moments of celebration, like our future is in great hands. So my ask today, you know, I always give you homework, is pause a little bit, celebrate one another, do a little bit of education. I thought I was well versed in Latinidad until Gabriela started, you know, her doctorate, you know, behavior in the beginning and educated me on 25 new things. So celebrate who we are, educate folks, show up for one another. And when we need advocacy, when we need you to physically show up, when we need you to write a check, when we need you to write a letter, when we need you to show up, that's what Maryland Latinos Unidos is about, is to unify our collective work. so that we're no longer fighting alone. I don't want one of you in your little tiny zip code, in your little tiny neighborhood, solito, llorando, trabajando como un perro, when you can bring it to all of us. And we got your back, whether we're light, dark, young, old, de cualquier sabor. Doesn't matter what you eat, spicy or not. We know we're a team. De verdad, we're always have had this inherent ability to unify and support. So let's celebrate the moment, but remember that the entire thing is ours, ¿verdad? Venimos aquí, our adopted country, to be together and try to get each other ahead. So ladies, you were fabulous. I can't even. I just like adore the three of you. Very nice.
Well, thank you, Veronica. As always, you're generous, kind, with your time and with all of your, all the energy you put behind everything. And if people are intimidated about you, let them eat cake. So thank you all for joining us today. Your comments in the chat are amazing. There's a Governor virtual event October 4th from 10 to 12 noon. Register here, please register. I just want to end by saying, as a former professor, I did put some homework, my suggested reading list of both novels, short stories, but also some critical analysis of US imperialism, starting with Eduardo Galeano, The Open Veins of Latin America. Enjoy this month. Learn during this month, share who you are. And, you know, I mean, I just shared a whole bunch of food. Go for it. Eat, enjoy, drink Argentine wine, Chilean wine, Mexican wine now. We're a little bit of everything. And I'm so grateful to all of you. I look at you as my community, and I can't be thankful enough that I know you have my back. And I want to add something to Veronica's point. We may run into trouble from time to time, and I don't know if this is going to come out right, but basically, it's not just winning together. You never lose alone. We're all with you. If you lose, we lose. And so it's not about winning and losing so much as it is about putting our arms together, linking them, and pulling forward like we always do as a community. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of the month, the rest of the day, and our legacy. I thank you, and have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us. Gracias a todos ustedes.